this. All right. Welcome everybody to the Busy Moms Book Club. I am Laura Johnson and I am your host for the book club, which is so fun. The book club is a passion project of mine because I love books so much and I'm reading them anyway. So I had this idea, over a year ago where I thought, well, if I'm reading these books, I might as well be sharing them with other people. And that's kind of how the book club came to be. So today we are doing Think Again. You never have to read the book to join. I always read the books and then I teach it to you, which is really fun. So this book is, let me show it to you, is Think Again by Adam Grant. And it is a hefty book. I'm not going to lie. So I love books. I love stories. I was kind of surprised, to be honest. I love Adam Grant. I've followed him online for a long time. I love a lot of his information that he shares. So I was kind of surprised that I wasn't as drawn into this book, but I still got a lot of information about it. So if you have read the book, I would love your opinion on that, on if it's one that you really were able to consume. I found for me, it was a little bit harder to binge read it. It was like I had to come back and do it in spurts because it felt a little more dry. But that's probably also because I'm not in academia. I am a coach. I love to hear people's stories, their life stories. So I found that as he was sharing a lot of his research about the book, my mind would kind of zone off. But if he was sharing stories about his life, his classroom, suddenly those were the things that really drew me in. And so that's probably the way my mind works. Not a bad thing by any means. I just wanted to preface that as we talk about this and if you go and actually read the book, it is an exceptional book. And it was one that I just needed to take, I feel like in sections and pieces as I went through. So we always start with a game, which you know very well. You're in the right place if. So you're in the right place if, like this book and this book club is for you, is if you have a fear of doing things the quote unquote right way. If you're always trying to get the right answer, if you're always trying to figure out the end from the beginning to make sure you're doing it the right way. So you're in the right place if you fall in that category. The second is if you have a fear of being arrogant or overly cocky. Now, that's not to say that you are, but that you're worried if you grow your confidence that you could accidentally become that. And you have a lot of examples in your mind of people that are that way, and you just repel, like everything about that just like irks you, and you don't want to be one of those people. You also know you're in the right place if you feel like your confidence level isn't what you want it to be. And you feel like if you could just have more confidence, then your goals would come easier and you would be accomplishing more things and you'd get your to-do list done and you could better teach your children, have, better self-esteem. And it all comes back to like this pressure that your confidence needs to be more. But then again, that fear of like going too far and then becoming arrogant. You also know if you're in the right place, if you're always wanting to fix people. If you get really frustrated, like if somebody's struggling and you keep telling them what they need to do and they don't take your advice, and then you get kind of irritated with them. So that's another one. And then the last one is if you avoid conflict to the point where you always want to be the peacemaker. You're always going around making sure everybody's happy. I see this a lot in my clients. We're moms. We want our children to have good, happy, fulfilling lives. And sometimes in that process or in our marriage, we're always trying to keep the other people happy. So if you're trying to avoid that conflict, you are in the right place. So what Adam Grant, the author of this book, what he really teaches us in the beginning is that each of us come in with a set of beliefs, thoughts, and the way that our brain works. This comes from generational, this comes from societal, this comes from religion, this comes from the world around us. We have created our own identity to think in a certain way. And what he challenges us in this book, and what I did really like about it, was that we get to this point where we get to start learning how to rethink and unlearn our identity and who we are. And that's how we create greater success. That's how we overcome stereotypes and judgments. That's how we create a more unified workplace and family, and how we can really start as a society creating the greater good together. But it comes down to those two words: rethinking and unlearning. And this really goes against what so many of us have been raised to do. And that's, that's the $1,000,000 question that, it kind of goes into the book, is because we are taught certain ways to think. Our parents teach us certain ways. And we are always in a classroom setting where we are having to learn content that's coming towards us. Now, he really challenges us to step outside of that box to unlearn some of these things. So the story that really stood out to me, there were a couple. I mean, he shared a lot of stories with a lot of statistics through the book. That goes back to the beginning of what I said, where it just felt really meaty to me. But in the beginning, he really prefaced it with a story that stood out to me and really stuck with me. So he talks about the wildfires in California, and how for the longest time there was, this procedure that California put in, that if you see a wildfire, it needs to be put completely out by 10 a.m. the next day. This started the early 1900s. And this has always been in place ever since then. But because of that, a lot of the dead stuff that needed to be burned out hasn't been burned out. And because of that, there's more and more wildfires that are starting to take place in California. And so he first talks about that container of like, this has been a problem. Nobody questioned, nobody rethought about the result that this thing was creating, this procedure that they set into place where every wildfire needs to be put out. Nobody questioned that. So there's kind of that he prefaces it with. And then he talks about smoke jumpers. So he explains this story of a smoke jumper. They are to go in and to create a barrier to kind of contain the fire so it doesn't continue to spread. So this group of smoke jumpers, they were put in not to fight the fire, but to create a barricade so the fire didn't continue to grow. And when they were in there, they suddenly realized that what they were trying to do wasn't going to work, that the fire was coming too fast, too strong, and that they were going to die essentially unless they did something different. And in this moment, they're trying to run up the hill to safety, and they just start booking it. At some point, their chief stopped and he said, "Everybody come over here, everybody follow me." And he takes out some matches and he starts lighting a fire around him. Now, he was never taught to do this. There was nothing in their manuals. There was nothing in the classroom that taught him, in order to fight a fire, you need to light fires. But he rethought about this, and I'm going to explain why this worked in a second. And he started to unlearn all of his training in order to save his life. Now, his crew thought he was crazy and they didn't follow him. But what he did is, as he was lighting these fires, he killed all of the grass around him. So once the fire came at him, there was nothing to burn around him. He laid face down and was able to breathe the oxygen right out of the ground. The rest of his team, I think they said in the book that 12 people ended up dying because they didn't follow him, because it went against what they were thinking and what they had learned. They couldn't unlearn it in that moment. So there was that example. And then the third example he talks about in the beginning is how smoke jumpers, they have this identity around, same with firefighters or wildfire fighters, where they have their tools. Their tools are part of their identity, part of their safety. And what they have found is, in a couple other studies where these firefighters had died in these wildfires, they were still holding their tools in their hand. And they did some calculations that had they been willing to drop their tools, they would have ran 15 to 20% faster away and could have saved themselves from the fire. But instead, they ended up dying chainsaw in hand. And so as he was introducing this, he was talking about, why is it that it's so hard for us to rethink and unlearn when it could save our lives? And he brings it back to, it is part of our identity. The way and the way in which we think and the way that we have learned is so integrated into the beliefs on who we are that it's more painful to abandon those than it is to think differently. And so in the situation with the firefighters, where he talks about, the chainsaw in hand, where they found these people that had died, they couldn't let go of their identity because therefore they would have failed. In their mind, they would have failed. And so that's where he really kind of sets the book up on why it's important to start rethinking and why it's important to start unlearning. So in the beginning, he goes into what he calls the preacher, the prosecutor, the politician, and the scientist. And so in order for us to rethink and to unlearn, it's important for us to recognize the difference between these. So I want you, let me find them really quick. Hold on. Okay, so he talks about, sorry, I don't have all of these bookmarked like I usually do. All right, so he talks about the preacher, how all of us fall in line with these at some point. The preacher is the one that has a certain set of beliefs that is going and, I always think of that phrase, preaching to the choir. Okay. Like they're going to stand up and they're going to share that from a pulpit, from social media. They're going to share their beliefs. We've got the prosecutor who will go out, and he will, or she will go out, and they will start ensuring other people are thinking like they do. They want to go out and really, prosecute people, really go after those people that think differently from them. And then we have the politician who will go and advocate to ensure other people will get on board with them. He said most of the problems that we have in society come from being a preacher, a prosecutor, and a politician. And we are all living within these at any given time until we start learning how to rethink and unlearn. The problem isn't always just being one of problem is when all three of these things come together to the point where we miss huge red flags. And so the example he shared in the book with regards to this is somebody that was investing a lot of money. They had, a family member that was getting really good returns. They had an advisor that say, like, this is what you want. And they started like prosecuting him almost. And so in the end, he ended up investing a lot of his money into this fund, and it did really well until it didn't. And he lost all of his money, which ended up being the Ponzi scheme that Bernie Madoff was in charge of and was running. Now, the interesting thing about this individual, and I don't remember his name, I'd have to go back to the book, where he was in the middle of writing a book about how people fall gullible, like how they become gullible and fall for false people, like things that aren't actually real. And so it was very ironic that he fell victim to this gullibility while he was writing a book on being gullible, because he was stuck in being the preacher, the prosecutor, and the politician, and having those people come at him without thinking clearly and looking from the fourth lens, which is the scientific lens. I can't talk and write at the same time. I always get my spelling wrong if I try and do that. So what he recommends is that we move to the scientific type mentality. And he refers back to this often throughout the book, where as we are looking at things from a new lens, we are always questioning and allowing ourselves to be wrong. And this is where, it goes back to the beginning on, when you're in the right place is if you have a fear of doing it wrong and you're always trying to do it right. So when we are in the scientific mode, we are always looking and questioning the beliefs that we have to see if there's another way to look at it. Now, it's fun to think about science time has changed. And about this in the book, how often we are, not even science. So what he talks about is how outdated and like our clothes get. That's a good example he uses in the book. So he talks about how it's very easy for us to go and refresh our wardrobe. We'll take out things, we'll buy new ones, all of that comes together. But yet when it comes to the beliefs that we have and how we're holding on to those beliefs, we are very unlikely to change. He says that outdated facts are mental fossils that are best to be abandoned. So he talks about how we get these mindsets from years ago that we've never been willing to update, as willing as we are like to change our clothes. Like that's not a big deal, but it's not attached to our identity. So he says, then when we start getting, all of these outdated facts in our minds and we're not updating it, that's where we have like mental fossils within our brain. And he says, it's just best to like really let those go. So as I was thinking about this and trying to apply it to myself, it made me think of a story that I was talking to my grandma about how things, science has changed, beliefs have changed, all of that has changed. And she was telling me that when my dad, who is, I think he just turned 65. So my dad just turned 65, and when he was a baby, my grandma was telling me that the doctors at the time firmly believed that between 2 to 4 months old, it was important for you to introduce orange juice to your baby. It seems laughable, right? Like, of course you wouldn't give orange juice to a 2-month-old baby, but she did because that's what the doctors told her to do. That was her being a good mom, was to introduce orange juice at the time that was appropriate, that the doctors recommended based on the science of the time. And so I think about how funny that is and how many beliefs that we have right now, science could later disprove, but it will be up to us on whether or not we can let go of those things as part of our identity, or if we're going to be stuck in the preacher, prosecutor, or politician type mentality. This is where we are constantly revising and revisiting and finding joy in being wrong about things. So he goes on to talk about, and I think this next part is really important, because he said, as we start moving forward on this, there's 2 types of syndromes that start to happen as we start moving towards the scientist mentality. He said, at this point, we are building and growing our confidence. And 2 things will start to happen. 2 syndromes will start to happen. It is what he calls, one you'll be familiar with, and one I had never heard of before, but he calls it the armchair quarterback. The armchair quarterback. And I don't know if he coined that term or if he made that up. I'm not sure. As well as the imposter syndrome. Now, many of us have heard about the imposter syndrome. Syndrome have an E? I'm not really sure. So we're going to keep it. I could have spelled wrong. So what he talks about is, at this point, we are trying to find what we call that sweet spot of confidence, or I guess is what Adam Grant calls the sweet spot of confidence, to where at this point, we all have this fear, this tipping point. We put confidence on the seesaw, where if you have too much confidence, you become arrogant. If you don't have enough confidence, then you're stepped on and you're meek, and everything, like people will walk all over you. So then you're always constantly on this like balancing act that you're trying to do with confidence. So what he talks about in this is that he talks about, let me see if I can find it really quick, how I love the way I'm going to get to that in just a second. He has this definition of arrogance that makes me laugh. And so we're going to get to that in just a second. So he says the armchair quarterback is somebody who thinks they know a lot about the game to the point where they are yelling at the coach from their armchair, thinking that they know better than the coach and the quarterback on how to run these plays. They are overly confident in their ability to do better than those that they're actually watching. So that's what he calls the armchair quarterback. On the flip side of that, the imposter syndrome is somebody that doesn't have any conviction or belief in themselves. And I think we've all been to that point before where we're starting to move forward and we don't think highly enough of ourselves to feel like what we're doing is right, or that we have the skills in order to be successful at doing this thing. I know that when I became a mom, I had horrible imposter syndrome. I I remember with my oldest, he turns 11 in like 2 days. And we were in the hospital and they told us that we could leave. My husband and I kind of looked at each other and we looked at our baby and we're like, we can just walk out with a human? They're like, yeah, it's your kid. When we started buckling him into the car, we're like, this feels illegal. Like we had imposter syndrome so bad that 2 days before we were not parents and now we're expected to keep a human alive. Like what's just happened? Like we doubted our capability to the point where it was so hard to function, not just because I just had a baby, but because my entire identity was not prepared. And I felt like a total imposter that I was not prepared to be a mom. And so we have these two things that most people will fall somewhere within that spectrum. What he recommends, and so what I wanted to share about the arrogance is he said, let's get really clear on what arrogance is. So coming to the armchair quarterback says, arrogance is ignorance plus conviction. He says, while humility is a permeable filter that absorbs life experience and converts it into knowledge and wisdom, arrogance is a rubber shield that life experience simply bounces off of. And so when we're thinking about and having that fear of am I being arrogant, what it really comes down to is, are you taking that scientific mindset and allowing life experiences to come in and to shape and mold and evolve who you are as an individual? Once you start doing that, you step away from that ignorance. You can still have conviction, but you have conviction in the sense that like life experience is shaping and evolving you, and you're able to stay humble by life and with that scientific mindset. So he goes on to say that humility. So when we're really looking at what is the difference, on the spectrum, where it's, you don't have to be one or the other. So what he introduces is a concept called confident humility. This is the answer to arrogance, and this is to arrogance and the answer to being so meek that you can't even function. And within this, this is what he calls like the sweet spot of confidence in here, is that you start becoming confident in how much you believe in yourself, but okay with being wrong about the tools or the skills that you have. So he said, humility is often misunderstood. It's not a matter of having low self-confidence. One of the Latin roots of humility means from the earth. It's about being grounded, recognizing that we're flawed and fallible. So it goes on to say, confidence is a measure of how much you believe in yourself. Evidence shows that's distinct from how much you believe in your methods. You can be confident in your ability to achieve a goal in the future while maintaining the humility to question whether you have the right tools in the present. That's the sweet spot of confidence. And so that's where I really wanted to spend, some of this time, is when we start developing the confident humility. And this is where we start being able to rethink and unlearn, because we can have confidence in our ability to do so, but be humble in the fact that we are flawed and fallible. And we may have to question and relearn some things. And we can introduce the joy of being wrong about stuff and not making it mean there's something wrong with who we are. And that's where I really wanted to spend some of the time. Is this is what allows us to exist and to rethink and unlearn. So he does go on to say confident humility doesn't just open our minds to rethinking, it improves the quality of our rethinking. And that is amazing to me to think about, where I see my clients go through this exact same thing, where they start seeing the world from a different lens. It's almost like the wheels were turning like this, and now the wheels start like evolving and shifting like this. And as they start to do that, they start to get better and increasing the results that they want in their life, because they're seeing the world from a different place. This becomes a lot of fun. Well, I mean, it's fun for me as their coach because I get to help guide them through that process. But it's also fun for them because so many of them have been stuck in a rut for so long that they're having a hard time getting out of that rut. The second they start moving towards confident humility, they're building their belief in themselves while questioning the tools that they've been using that may not be the most effective tools for them or for their family. So he then goes on to say, as part of the confident humility, and I really liked that he brought this up, because we have this belief that the imposter syndrome should be avoided at all costs, that we should always just be living from this place of confidence and I'm on top of the world and, all these great things. When in reality, he said the imposter syndrome can actually be a good thing. When used correctly, the imposter syndrome can make us better learners. And I really liked that, because that allows for us to be flawed humans while still accomplishing the things that we want, while still being great humans and doing a lot of good in the world. And so at that point, when our imposter syndrome starts to increase, we can use it as something motivating us forward, instead of like dropping everything and putting all of our energy over trying to fix this thing. It can be there and it can be a motivating factor for us. He says, we don't have to wait for our confidence to rise to achieve challenging goals. We can build it through achieving challenging goals. And that's where that imposter syndrome can become such a benefit. And so when I think about this in terms of moms and how this applies to our family, it's important for us to learn this for ourselves and then be able to teach it to our children. So when I think about being able to increase, let me write it out this way. So at one point, I thought that I had to be confident in order to move forward in my life. So I spent so much time focusing on confidence, reading the books about confidence, positive thoughts, like when I looked in the mirror. And I spent so much time building a mindset about confidence, but yet it was like I was never confident enough. Where was the line? Where could I finally start living the life that I wanted? Was like it was always on hold because I wasn't confident enough. And I see this in so many of my clients, where once what they think will happen, and this goes back from Grant, the scientific mindset, is if they reach a certain point of confidence, then things will come easier down the road and they won't have to fail as much. When we're looking at the scientific mindset and having to rethink about things, he talks a lot about learning how to find the joy of being wrong, that it's okay for us to fail. It's okay for us to learn something and do something different. And when we are engaging in that process, we are building confidence through our challenging goals. So instead of waiting until you reach this point and then moving forward, you're actually moving forward all along, and your confidence just starts to grow. It's like this increasing, it's like this exponential growth that the more you're moving towards your goals, the more confident you become, because you are learning and relearning and unlearning everything in the process. So you're building your confidence through achieving challenging goals. And I really appreciated that he said that, because I do think that is something that is kind of a fallacy when we're learning about confidence. And so I wanted to spend time on that. He goes on to say that, sorry, I got a hair in my face. He goes on to say that arrogance leaves us blind to our weakness. Humility is a reflective lens. It helps us see them clearly. Confident humility is a corrective lens. It enables us to overcome those weaknesses. And so as you're moving forward in that scientific mindset, what you're always doing is increasing your ability to overcome weakness. And as you do that, you are becoming more confident through the process. So he goes on to talk about the difference between being right and being wrong. And I think it's really fantastic because I thought that if I could get all the answers right in everything I was doing, then life would be easier. And I have seen how quickly that just isn't the case. And I love that as he mentioned, with the scientific method, where you start with the scientific mindset, is that you start with some kind of hypothesis. And with this hypothesis, then you go and test it. And as you're testing it, you're looking for what the results are. You have some kind of time period to it that you're testing this hypothesis. And then you're examining the results. Based on those results, you decide if you want to keep the same hypothesis or if you're going to make tweaks to it and try it with a new hypothesis. This is what I teach with my decision-making process, to my clients. And what we're doing in that, and what I've always tried to teach my clients, is that what we want is to see if our hypothesis works, if the decision that we make actually works. What we're doing in that process is we are testing something not to get it right, but to really see like what works and what doesn't work. And in that moment, we're inviting ourselves to potentially be wrong. Not that we're wrong, but the thing that we were testing was wrong. It didn't work the way we thought it would. It doesn't mean that anything's gone wrong. And so when we're looking at this from a place of, like always trying to get it right, then what we're doing is we're trying to avoid discomfort. And that's just not possible. There will always be discomfort in life. And so you'll either never test a hypothesis, or you'll be always trying to implement this thing, trying to get it right, and you get so burned out. Or you'll make some story up. If it didn't work out the way you thought, you'll make some story up that like there's something wrong with you. So what I love where he talks about how in our brain, we always have what he calls like our inner dictator. And hold on real quick. We're letting somebody else into the book club. And so, Gail, I'm just going to mute you really quick. Welcome, Gail. So what he's talking about is that we all have this miniature dictator living in our heads that's controlling the flow of facts to our minds. Its job is to keep out threatening information. It keeps us, it's like he calls it the bodyguards of our mind, protecting our self-image and keeping us like feeding these lines. So when we have something that comes up that threatens the way our mind thinks, then we start getting really triggered, and we trigger the fight or flight response to where our nervous systems will start to shut down. He said, we choose our views and we can choose to rethink them anytime we want. But what we have to do is learn how to live with the inner dictator in our brain, which is enjoyable, doesn't it? So he goes on to say that at some point, as we're creating this scientific mindset, it's our job to start finding and questioning and finding joy in being wrong about things. And it's not that we have to make it mean something about us. It just means that we are starting to get closer and closer to a right answer. And at that point, when we start doing that, that's when our ability to rethink really starts to come into play. Um, so there was, let me go. So at that point, that's where we start seeking out more information to start challenging the way that our minds work. And I really like that he mentions this in the book, that as we're moving towards it's okay for us to be wrong in our views, that we can find joy in it, and it doesn't have to degrade our beliefs about who we are and our identity. I wanted to share a little experience about, for me and what I had with this. He said, it's good to seek out that information that goes against your current views in that process of developing that joy, that it's okay to be wrong. And so for the longest time, this was a couple of years ago. I had little kids at home. I wasn't traveling. I wasn't seeing the world. I wasn't in a spot where I could really put myself not out of my comfort zone, but in like different communities, just because I was home and I was raising my littles, and we just weren't doing that. And I live in a very I would say like upper middle class area. There's a lot of people that are Caucasian like me. A lot of women do stay home from work. And it was just kind of this, I looked around and I felt like a Stepford wife, for lack of a better word. And it was like, I'm looking down and like, everybody looks like me. A lot of people think like me. We all kind of attend the same church. Like, what is happening? And I realized that I do feel very strongly about my beliefs, but I wasn't challenging my beliefs and my view on the world. And I was looking at it from my lens, but I knew that there were other lenses that existed in the world. And I wanted to start seeing the world from other views so that I could challenge my own beliefs. So one of the experiments that I did when I was doing this is, for, I guess it was maybe a year and a half, I would find books that it couldn't be from somebody that was Caucasian. It couldn't be from somebody that was middle class. It couldn't be from somebody of my own country, or it had to be from a different location in the country. And what I really started to find and like really expand my view on the world, based on seeing the world through an author that was different, that had a different perspective from me. I read the most amazing life-altering books. At some point, maybe I'll even share some of those in when I send out the replay. I can share some of those books that really helped me question my view of the world and how everybody else has their own unique perspective, so that I could really start seeing, where am I flawed in my thinking? Where have I stepped into the persecutor, the prosecutor, or the politician? Where am I using my resources to stand my ground on things that could be a little flawed, or in some cases a lot flawed? And so really at that point, and this is, very personal that I share, I feel like I'm a very open-minded, a very loving person, but even to the point where at one point I typed into Google, like, am I racist? Like, I really wanted to understand my own brain. Of course, I would never call myself racist. Of course, like, I love humans. I would never treat anybody derogatory, but that doesn't mean that there isn't some in me based on the way that I have been raised in society and all of that. And so I really like took a step back and I started questioning, every piece of my identity. I started taking off the shelf and questioning it to make sure that I didn't have mental fossils in my brain, that I wanted to disprove myself in so many ways so that I could see the world differently from the way that other people do. And I started finding so much joy in being wrong about the way I believed about things. So much of my identities I had never questioned, especially, there's a little fly in here, especially when it came to my political views and and religious views. And suddenly the whole world opened up to me, and I was able to see it through such a beautiful, unique, complex lens that started to happen. For me, that was very beneficial. And I'm so grateful I went to that place. As Adam Grant talks about in the book, you want to put yourself in that opportunity to question your views, to rethink the way you've always thought, to really give yourself that chance to unlearn some of the things that you've been believing for the last 20 years that may not be as accurate as it is right now. And so, as we're doing that, what you'll start to find is that you will start to find a lot of joy in these discoveries around yourself, and that every person that you start learning from offers something new to you. Not that we're using people, it's not like there's an agenda or anything like that. Like, that's never anybody else's job to teach us. That's our responsibility. But when you're interacting with people, suddenly you're seeing the world from a very different place. So then he goes on to talk about how when you're starting to build out your community, and as you're starting to find this joy of being wrong a little bit more, what you also want to create is a challenge network, is what he calls it, not a support network. And he said, it's always important for us to have cheerleaders. It's always important for us to have somebody we can lean on. Who are the people that challenge the way you think? And I remember talking with somebody, from high school about another friend who had a very different set of views. And this friend from high school, I remember her telling me, like, I just stopped following this person because his views were so different from mine. And I remember stepping back being like, you don't follow somebody? And everybody has their own choices. I don't mean to judge her choices by any means. I liked his perspective because it challenged me to think differently about mine. And it opened my mind to a different way of thinking. There were times that I disagreed, but I enjoyed the experience of having that challenge, to make sure that I'm always in a place where I agree with my views and I'm checking in with them and unlearning the things that I need to. So then he goes on to say that disagreements don't have to be disagreeable. And I really liked the way he talks about this, on the difference between relationship conflict versus task conflict. So he said the difference here is that it's okay for us to have disagreements about tasks, the way we accomplish things, really getting to what is the best scenario here. So he talks about when people are going to debate something, it's very different to debate intellectually than it is to debate personally. And the example he showed was the Wright brothers when they were building the first flying airplane. He said these brothers loved each other to the ends of the earth, but they could really fight for months on end. They'd really go at it. But then the next day they would wake up and be able to solve something. And so he talks about how conflict can really bring us together, how being able to have task conflict to where we're debating and disagreeing is very beneficial. The difference is when we move into relationship conflict, where we become disagreeable, where we start personally attacking the other person. So he gives some really great examples of this in the book, but one that really stood out to my mind is when you're saying, okay, I disagree with this. And then you take it one step further on, why do you always disagree with me? You never like my ideas. And suddenly it becomes a personal attack versus we're creating something amazing together. And then we can really focus on the task together. And so that's one thing to really be aware of. And as I mentioned in the beginning, if you have this fear, of avoiding conflict, it could be, or if you're always trying to avoid conflict, it could be in the past you have been in a place where you went from task conflict to relationship conflict to where it felt like a personal attack. And being able to learn how to have disagreements without having to get to this place where it's a personal attack is a learned skill. Again, we're having to unlearn and rethink the way we've been existing in the world. You may have been raised in a home where conflict was a very bad thing, where there were insults flying around all the time. And so it gives you an opportunity to learn a new skill of how do I have conflict that's productive without having to be insulting and have personal attacks. So then he goes on to say, and I'll leave this with for the last little bit, is when we start finding, when we start rethinking and unlearning, we want to share that with other people. And when we start going through these self-discoveries, it's easy for us to go back into the politician, prosecutor, or preacher. I couldn't think of the last one. There we go. You probably knew what it was. So when we start unlearning and rethinking, we want to drop back into those to kind of shake people like, there's more to life. I want you to know these things. But that's not how we persuade people. That's not how we change their minds. And so he talks a lot, and this is where I would recommend you really spend time on being able to introduce the mindset of active learning and active listening within your home, within your workplace, within every relationship that you're in. So he uses some really amazing examples. So one example, he talks about being an active listener and asking open-ended questions to where people will start relearning or unlearning and rethinking on their own when you are actively listening, not with an agenda, but to just understand and stay in that scientific mentality and then support them in whichever way they decide to go. So the example that he used was a Black musician who had, because of the active listening that he did, he was able to help many KKK, like 200 plus members, high level members of the KKK, completely abort their beliefs on white supremacy. And many of them left the KKK. And one example he shared was later on, him and one of the top KKK members, this Black musician, a KKK member, where they became friends. And he eventually was asked to be the godfather to this previous KKK member. And I think how beautiful that is, that sometimes we think we have to preach our beliefs in order to persuade people for the greater good. But when we are actively listening, when we are trying to understand somebody, that changes everything quicker than us sharing our views. When we're able to open their minds, and again, not from a place of hidden agenda, but from a place of we maintain our scientific mindset, where we are very inquisitive about the way they believe and why they believe it, then we invite a greater good. He also goes on to say that when you're inviting this like into your home, you're creating a learning atmosphere. And I've seen this with my own kids so much, where I can tell them something to do and they're going to push back even if they agree with it. They're like, gosh dang it, we both know what you need to do. Why do you push back? And for me, that's really frustrating as a parent. But what I'm doing is I'm coming against their inner dictator within their own brain, where we're fighting against their fight or flight response. When in reality, we can step back and we can create that active listening on what do you think is the next step, and just being there to support them in whatever they choose to do in that next step. What you're doing is creating that learning environment. And so what I loved about the example he shared with us, and what we find when we're parenting from this place, that we often learn just as much as our kids do. And so yesterday I had this experience, and I'll leave you with this last story. where I was already like rethinking and unlearning. Okay. It was already on my mind. And I had gone to the dentist to have my oldest have his cavities filled. He's just got like one or two. And the dentist has always been an amazing experience. I've tried so hard to allow it to be a safe place. But friends have shared with them about how horrible cavities were. And that triggered his fight or flight to where when we got there, he had a full on to the point where I couldn't even get him out of the car. Like imagine a 20-week pregnant lady trying to drag an 11-year-old out of the car. Like it was ridiculous. And so as I'm trying to like just get him in there to where he's not running away, because he has a habit of running away when he's in a panic, but also trying to communicate inside with the people at the front desk so they know I'm not just missing the appointment. I'm like in this middle, like trying to know what to do. And thankfully they came out, they saw from the window, came out, we were able to reschedule it. It was fine. But what I realized in that moment was that I had this opportunity to punish him, or I had this opportunity to rethink and unlearn what I thought was the right parenting mode, which was you didn't make the appointment. Now you're in trouble. That's what, what I thought, that was like the thinking that I had on how to be a good mom. But what I realized was in that moment, I needed to teach him about what was happening in his body so that he knew what a panic attack was. He understood why his body was shutting down in that moment. And I had that moment of like, well, I can't reward him. And I was like, forget that. Like, I don't care. Like, I'm going to unlearn. So we went for milkshakes and we talked about nervous systems and we talked about our bodies and what happened in that moment and what was happening in his brain that caused his body to shut down. That was amazing. Like the experience we had was such a bonding experience together to where we could have these very adult-like conversations about our bodies instead of me just ruining the rest of the day by punishing them because that was the quote unquote right thing to do. And so in that moment, what I was trying to do was I was trying to unlearn and rethink, how can I help my kid navigate a very challenging experience for him in his body that will set him up for greater success in the road. I do believe that that was the right answer. It may not have been the right answer for every parent, but for us, that was the right answer. But it came from me having to really be okay, one, with conflict and really unlearning and rethinking from a scientific mindset to where how can I make this more effective? Here's my hypothesis. Let's try it out. And it worked. It was very cool. So go read the book. There's a lot that we weren't able to cover. Like I said, it's very meaty, but you are going to enjoy it. You might need to, like me, take it in smaller chunks because there is a lot of information in there. But I hope that this has been beneficial for you. Please go over. You are welcome to unmute, or you can go over to the chat box, share any questions or comments that you have. And I'll go ahead and turn the recording off, but I would love to hear any questions you have. I've got a couple minutes I can stay on. So I'm going to stop the recording.